This is a law talk, mostly. So I apologize if I bore you at any time. It's natural. It's, you know, I have 3 years of postgraduate education in boring people and being a pain in the ass. Just to kind of know the audience. Anyone here in compliance? Good, we'll talk shit about that. Straight IT, not security? All security? Awesome. Okay. Because I'm a lawyer, every talk starts with the disclaimer. So, I am a lawyer, not your lawyer. I'm a consultant and I can be your consultant. I'm easily bribed. Many of these laws are new, which is code for, I'm making some guesses as to what they actually are going to mean. Like, a 50-year-old law has 50 years of precedent, and we know what each of the words means, and we get detailed findings on a bare statute where no one's interpreted it. We're making educated guesses. Or, as I like to say it, until I'm wearing black robes, my opinions don't have much weight. Because I talk to a lot of people who are lawyers and like, well, this is what it means. Like, really? What court of appeals are you sitting on? Until then, like, your opinion is as valuable as mine. And I spend a fair amount of time trying to drink with regulators and people who work for various agencies that may enforce these to get, like, what do you think it means? What are you where your direction is going to be? To get some idea. And of course, because I'm drinking with them, the recollections are often fuzzy. So I have been wrong before. I'm on paper as saying that the idea of the iTunes selling television shows was the stupidest idea I've ever heard, and, well, I will admit when I am wrong. Not speaking for my clients or my employer, if I still have one at the end of the talk. Okay, why? Why is the regulation? Most of these laws attempt to fix problems that we have recognized, right? Sometimes they're also a way of working out a fundamental disagreement about what the internet is for. Like, how are we supposed to live on it, right? Because, like, privacy. We all like privacy, but also, you are a product, right? Those are two conflicting views, and that's mostly my rant about, not really my rant, a way of explaining European views about privacy and the GDPR versus, say, the American view. You know, like, hey, we want to collect a lot of information about you, and we own that information because that's the product. You know, if you're not paying for it, you're the product. Versus the European view, which is like, no, really, you're not a product, you're a person. And your relationship with Facebook, or Twitter, or Google is different. So, free flow of information versus criminal facilitation, right? Is it okay to do anything on the internet? Sometimes that flow of information is facilitating criminal enterprises. And we can take a view that's like, well, it's the internet, just speech. Versus, no, your website is dedicated to making the world a more efficient place for your criminal market. Like, facilitation of drug sales, facilitation of illegal firearm sales, facilitation of prostitution, right? And we have to we figure out where the lines are. And, well, these laws are attempts to make that happen. So, one theme I want to work on is regulation is an attempt to fix market failure, right? We have generally a free flow of information, open marketplace of information, but sometimes we recognize that a service we're offering on the internet or a business model is flawed. For example, like take Equifax as an example. There's a large externality to Equifax's business model. You cannot opt out, right? Because you're not actually a customer. You are a product. The people you do business with send information to Equifax. And when they got breached and dumped all that info, it's like, well, you have, who are you in this contract? You have nothing. So many of these laws are an attempt to bring some equity back to the relationship. So we also have a problem with asymmetric information. How can you identify the risk you're taking in adopting, entering your information into a social network, or developing a new business partner? It's difficult. You have to assess how much damage they can do to your life, and sometimes you have no idea. Like, who here knew about Equifax's Apache Struts problem until it showed up on Krebs, right? No one did a pen test against Equifax to figure out if there were a risk to them or not. Clearly Equifax didn't. So risk management is a business decision. If you think of the leaders of the business, especially a large organization, they're generally generalists. They think about all the things that they have to do to keep the business moving forward, operating, surviving in a changing marketplace, and our little niche, cybersecurity, is just one of the many, many risks that they're looking at. And I want to give the idea of well-understood versus inchoate risks about this. For example, I'm thinking of a client of mine that they're a software manufacturer that essentially works in the SAP environment. And if you've ever touched SAP, I'm sorry. SAP isn't so much a product as it is a relationship for life. You don't roll SAP quickly, and if you're in that ecosystem, generally your contracts are long-lived because an SAP rollout is a long time, an SAP installation lives a long time, it's core to your business. And I was privy to be helping them work out major strategy problems, and they recognized they had two risks in 2017. One was fluctuating, they were an American company, most of their business was in Europe. And because it's a competitive marketplace, their contracts were thin margin. They had a lot of expensive people they had to hire to provide their service, and fluctuation between the US dollar, because they paid the developers in US dollars. However, their contracts were with European companies, so they're billed in euro. And if the euro fluctuates in the wrong direction, a profitable contract becomes unprofitable. The other was cyber. What do we do about the cybers? And the problem was that I'm pitching what they need to do, what controls they need to put in place, how they need to do these things. And the problem they run into is the financial people were able to come out with a really, really nice tight model about where the euro-dollar relationship was likely going to, it's going to fluctuate, but there's tight bands, and they can hedge for that risk. And when I talked about how much you had to spend for cyber, it's well, if we spend more money, how much do we save the risk? I'm I can tell you a number, but it's going to be a lie. What if we spend less money? Your risk goes up. But what does that do to our bottom line? I'm it would be bad if you got breached. How's that? Honestly, I cannot give you, I can say that if you don't do a code review, you increase the risk of vulnerabilities that will cause a problem in the future. But I can't be as specific as the person who says, we have a 95% accurate model that will predict the euro-dollar relationship will be here, so any contract over this number will be profitable, any contract less than that is a risk of not being profitable. Done. They can speak with certainty, I can't. So going and talking to senior management about risk in cyber is hard. These regulations actually in some ways make it easier because risk of breach versus fines. I can point to a number. HIPAA, hey, look, this company got fined this amount of dollars for a breach that looks kind of like the risk you're having. I can't say that you're going to have the same loss, but I can point to it and go, that number would suck. So, well-defined, well-handled, I can hedge against some risks. We can't really talk about cyber risk in as well-defined terms, and we can't hedge against it as well as you can say and insurance risk of flood. So, and the other concept is, most of the time, cyber risks aren't existential. Few companies go out of business because of a cyber problem, right? Even companies that you think of, like, your entire business is in keeping things private. The example I give is Ashley Madison, right? Company that was holding data that you really, really, really don't want to get out there. And they get breached, and they're still in business, right? So, versus like other companies go out of business because you screwed up your model for exchange rate fluctuations. You screwed up your model for what's going to be the new product that you have to put out, right? Kmart went out of business because they just couldn't do retail well against, say, Walmart and then later Amazon. Easy. Easy to understand, hard to do, right? So the first thing I want to talk about is, and this is the interesting one, is SEC guidance. SEC regulates publicly traded companies in the United States. And they've been kind of late to the cyber game versus, say, FTC or going back to, say, the banking regulators. And new guidance is that incidents, used to be that incidents had to be reported to investors if they materially affect an investor's reasonable decision to invest in a company or sell their shares. Now, cyber risks, if they're substantial enough to affect an investor's decision to buy or sell that stock, have to be reported when well known. So, think about that. Those of you working in cyber know that you have the one or two problems that really, really bug you, right? They're the ones that keep you up at night. You finally have a tool now, if you're smart, that you can use to say, it hasn't, because think of, and I sorry to beat up Equifax, but I'm sure there's an email somewhere by someone in either their DevOps arm or their security arm going, we really need to patch this struts problem, right? It's high CVE, it's well known to be vulnerable. All it is a patch, and maybe it was you didn't have enough dev time to fix the underlying application, relied upon struts, and that all your devs are overwhelmed, and like, look, we'll push that app off, go away. We think it's a reasonable risk. It hasn't been breached yet that you know of. But if that risk is big enough that an investor might say no, or an investor who holds stock might sell it, that has to be reported. So that's now all of a sudden kind of interesting, because I'm thinking of a gig I did this week where a company was buying a little startup that had a really neat algorithm to do something really cool, and we did a review on that little company's infrastructure, and it was like, it's going to cost a lot of money to fix all this. Get to the algorithm school, get to the app school, but odds are, since they've never done a code review, they've never done a pen test, it's going to be a parade of horrors when outsiders go and poke at it. And got back on Friday that they're changing their valuation of the acquisition for risk, not for actual breach, just for the risk. So all of a sudden, this is starting to beam through. So SEC guidance is broader than state breach notification or HIPAA. It's if there is a probability that something is big enough to cause a change in valuation, right? Because you've got state laws, usually PII and something else, banking, account and password, government ID, HIPAA's PII and healthcare info. This is just a breach of something that's big enough to worry investors. So, risk must be disclosed if material to an investor. Interesting. Now, of course, this is for publicly traded companies. If you're not publicly traded, the SEC guidance isn't necessary. If you're not big enough to trip that wire, that's just there. But then again, every company that isn't publicly traded is thinking about it in the future. So if you've got that big, ugly risk that's not well understood outside of your shop, you can use this as a little bit of leverage to say, we should fix this before you guys decide to do something financial. So, next interesting bit is Federal Trade Commission after the LabMD case. FTC regulates interstate trade. Well understood, been around for a long time. They regulate unfair trade practices and deceptive trade practices. An unfair trade practice is something that is just, we're going to hold it. You shouldn't be allowed to be in the business if you are that or worse. There's deceptive trade practices where we have lied to you about our product or service in some way. And this comes out of the Wyndham case. Wyndham Hotels had on their website, here's why you should trust us with your data. And it was like, they had to click about 5 links to get there. And they said, we have good security holding credit cards, we have good security holding your bookings, and they didn't. The laughable level of security. Credit cards stored in plain text on internet accessible systems. Anyone in the hotel could get on the Wi-Fi and use that to access. It was like, looking at that like, okay, and you realize this, right? For most people, hotel security is like, we're not holding banking banking information, except everyone who booked. What's the first thing you do when you book into a hotel? Can I see your credit card? And if they're storing that in plain text on a server that's accessible to anyone on the guest Wi-Fi, and well, they had a breach, dumped a bunch of stuff, and the FTC went after them saying, you're deceptive because you said you had security and you didn't. But we're also going after you under the idea that your security was so bad, even if you didn't make the promise, it was unfair. You shouldn't be allowed to get away with that, even if you didn't lie about it. Wyndham, fights back. Wyndham loses. All of a sudden, FTC says, wait a minute, we just kind of stumbled into being a cybersecurity regulator for non-banking, non-healthcare, non-government contractors. So all the other business, the 99% of the economy, well, financial services data, Matt, but all the other businesses, the people sell you cars, and the people sell you tires, and the people sell you food, and people who your cable company, all that all of a sudden are under that FTC regulation. And all of a sudden now it's like, well, there's a standard. Now, of course, the FTC quickly kind of scrambled and said, okay, what do we want to kind of establish as a standard? And they weren't allowed to establish something like NIST 853, or NIST 800-171, or ISO 27001-2. They were like, we can establish a standard that is not laughable. We can go after that. The stuff that's like, that's horrible. 12-year-olds go, oh, goddamn, that's some bad security. And all of a sudden they're like knocking on doors and going, we've had complaints that your security is bad. Someone stayed near a hotel, someone ate at your restaurant, and they, I'm thinking of Red Robin. First time I ate at one with 4 of my coworkers, we spent more time messing with the touch screen to figure out if we could own it than we did eating. I won't say whether or not we breached it, but laughably bad security was their regulatory power. And with LabMD, there's a complaint. What they do is they do a consent decree where they say, you must now meet these standards. And they weren't laughably low. They were like, okay, those are reasonable. Those are the sort of things that any vendor management process would require. If you're a larger company bringing on a vendor, you would ask for these things. But it's higher than laughable. And LabMD says, you can't make us. You can declare that our standards are insufficient, but you cannot give us a set of standards and make us meet it. They have a lawsuit, and LabMD wins. FTC can't require specific controls. They can say, your controls are insufficient and we can pursue you. But they can't say, you will be pursued unless you meet these standards. And I realize it's splitting some hairs, but it essentially cuts the FTC's power a little bit. So they can go after you if you're laughably bad, but they can't say you didn't meet our standards. They can't set a standard. GDPR. Anyone here hasn't heard of it? Okay, I was going to ask you now, because I gave this talk once and people put up their hands. I'm like, what? Is it nice under the rock you've been living? Right? And I have friends who do IT in Europe, and they're like, I would like there to be someone talking about something other than GDPR. Like they have, there's signs at bus stations. Are you GDPR compliant? I'm like, I see that every day. Please stop. So, quick run through. Scope is EU data subjects. You are an EU citizen in the EU. Your data is protected under the GDPR. An EU subject in the United States is not. You're an American in Europe? Sorry. But EU citizen or permanent resident in the EU, you're covered. Went into effect May 25th, yet somehow the sun came up the next day. The internet still worked. I checked. I spent a week in Spain a week ago, and they have the internet, and it still works. Of course, every time you open a site, it's like, hey, you're coming from the EU. Here's our privacy policy. We're going to put cookies on your system. Click, 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 go away. But it's interesting to see. We've adapted. We've figured this out. We wrote privacy policies. Of course, we won't see if they're actually held to, but we wrote privacy policies. Problem fixed. Next problem. But it's, we shoved out privacy policies and we went to bed. Data subjects have rights. What a concept. Data controllers have responsibilities, right? If I ask you for data to do my business, I have now some responsibilities. Now, of course, what made this interesting was it's got teeth. Everyone beats this up. Significant fines, 4% of gross revenue or 20 million euro. And I realized that a 20 million euro fine is like, okay, I'm paying attention now. Even the most tired, I don't care board members, like 20 million euro is something that I can comprehend. That's a lot of money. Also, more importantly, they have a death penalty in it. A stop data processing order, which is you may not process data. You may not process EU citizen data, which basically means you have to, you cannot, if you have to go to cash only, and if you're in a data broker like business, like a social networking, all of a sudden like, wow, we can't do our business in your country. We have to withdraw from the market. So, fallout. How's there been impact? Because we haven't actually seen extensive regulation. And I like to say, I thank Facebook for their blunder, because that means that every privacy regulator is going to chew on them for the next 18 months, and all of our clients who are smaller in niche markets are like, yeah, let's watch Facebook and see what comes out of that. You have a privacy policy? Good. The best guidance I've seen, sadly, comes out of the UK's Information Control Office, the ICO, because the UK is leaving the EU. So, the really valuable, they have actually a checklist that you click, and it's like, what do I do with the data? I do this, this, and this. Okay, these are your requirements. I'm like, that's beautiful. It showed that to all my clients. Like, fill that out and come back to me. Instead of me coming up with a questionnaire. And when they finally Brexit, it won't be valuable anymore. So, cause some entities just leave the market entirely. I know, a handful of companies were like, how much business do you do in the EU? And they're like, we have one French customer. Like, one French company doing business with you? Like, no, there's one guy outside of Paris. I'm like, call him up and say, you're out, right? If how much money do you make in person? Maybe 80 euro. This year? No, in the last 5 years. Like, thanks. Is your product available elsewhere? Yeah. Amazon.fr? Okay, fine. We're out. Some companies left. Some were like, this is more bother than we want, we're out. lots of unanswered questions. I still get this from my clients. I will probably get this until I die. And it's like, a lot of them are hard. A lot of them are like, I don't know. Because the one, what is reasonable security under the article that requires security? Acceptable implementation of rights. This one is still puzzling me because you have the right to be forgotten order, which is, I did business with you in the past, I want you to delete all that data unless it's required by your country's laws. And the one that I got when I'm dealing with the IT staff of a company that had a substantial EU presence, and I can't do their accents well because it was 2 Germans, a French citizen, and 2 Brits. And the Brits were the hardest to understand. They were from like northern England, and they're like, you need subtitles. But the question was, we have a bunch of DLTs. For those of you who remember old backups, they're tapes that you put your backups on. And I'm like, oh, damn. Right to be forgotten, like, oh, I don't know. Like, you know what they are? Like, I remember them. I have a cut of my thumb from a DLT reader. Yes, I remember them. I don't know if the GDPR requires you to go through, because like, how do you do that? You know, like, here's a bunch of Reddit crates. Go find, Hans Pain in the Ass, who filed this right to be forgotten order, and go, rack all the DLTs. Like, I don't even know, because everyone who's been a backup admin, you get that, like, here's a rack of DLTs, here's a box of DLTs, like, what's on them? Backups. What's the date? Yes. What's on them? Stuff. And you go through and you're like, okay. Date to date, that makes sense. Date to date, blue. Why is it called blue? Oh, well, we did red, yellow, green, blue for backups, for weeklies. Okay. What's the green one then for? Oh, that was a special one. Where's this documented? Bob. Oh. So you're going to have an intern, you're like, find an intern who's going to like, hey, I'm new and shiny, I want to do IT. Okay. What's your first job? Get a cup of coffee. What's the next thing? That's a DLT reader. What's that? Stack of tapes. What are you doing? Find everything that's got Hans's name on it and delete it. How long will this take? Until you lose your mind. And then someone's like, I'm going to study something else. I don't want to do IT. Right? Like, how do you solve it? They're like, I'm going to wait and see. Right? If someone asks you, like, yes, we've deleted from all of our active stuff, and as far as we know, those DLTs are gone. Either that or there's going to be a massive sale on bulk magnet erasers. It's like, yep, gone. Yeah, Hans's data's gone. What about our backups? Yes. Right. How will this get enforced? Now this is the fun part. Every member state has to figure this out, how to implement it, what their guidance is going to be. So French rules may be different than Italian rules, than Spanish rules, than Portuguese rules. Because Schrems, Max Schrems, who's Facebook, says that there's a minimum standard under the GDPR, or under 9546 that becomes the GDPR, but every member state can come up with their own rules that are more restrictive, just to make things more fun. So, my prediction is, because it's going to be, do they go after bad actors? There's a lot of people who are just, the people who actually need to get kind of kicked out of the game, right? The spammers, the bad marketers. Versus, are there going to be regulators like, I want Facebook on my wall, right? Versus, like, there are a bunch of just like low-level scumbags. Like, knock them out? Don't know. And each regulator is going to have to figure out what they're going to go after. Other fun bit is Privacy Shield might be going away. For those of you who are unfamiliar, Privacy Shield was a recognition that there is an IT, well, much of the internet comes out of the United States. Because EU says, for you to process data, you either have to be in the EU, or you have to be in a country that has the same or similar privacy rights to the EU's. We don't meet that requirement because we don't really have privacy laws here. So all of a sudden, like, Canadian data centers became really hot property because Canada is recognized having similar data protection laws to the EU. So you can just like rack and stack all your junk in Canada. However, you want to then export that data back. And the idea of exporting data is kind of a weird concept. Like, it's in the cloud. And then you're like, no, but that part of the cloud's Canada. Huh. Well, I want to process the entire database. Nope, there are French people in that database. So all of a sudden you have to like recreate all this. And Privacy Shield is a recognition like, you can say, I will follow EU data privacy laws at my company and allow the FTC to regulate me. And therefore, okay, well, just hand wave and good. You're good enough. You can put everyone in that big database. However, EU regulators are viewing like, you really don't enforce this. We might actually suspend the Privacy Shield, so you actually have to then put your stuff back in, EU or Canadian or I'm trying to think, there are other countries that meet that requirement. I generally recommend to my clients, like, look, Canada data centers are, for most people, fairly accessible to a US-based staff. Like, if you actually have to go and lay hands on a server, Toronto isn't that far away. So it's like I'm doing a wait-and-see approach to that for my recommendations. This is the fun one. Because we can't leave well enough alone, Cloud Act is an attempt to get over a ploy that Microsoft played a couple years ago. They have a bunch of their Azure stuff is in Ireland, and they mostly did this for like Ireland is a really great place to base stuff for the EU, English-speaking staff. It's accessible, and they don't tax authors, and software is considered right of active authorship, so it's a great tax haven as well. So like, okay, all of a sudden you have like significant IT presence in Ireland. The FBI says, we want data held on your servers, and Microsoft says, you want data about an EU citizen stored on an EU server. We don't have to give it to you. This subpoena works for US held assets. That is Microsoft.ie. It's a subsidiary, sure, but it's a European subsidiary. And they win. They win in court. Like, yep, you're right. That's outside of FBI's jurisdiction. Like, and Microsoft goes, neener, we protect your security. Well, we as Americans have to fix that. We passed the Cloud Act that says, Stored Communications Act and the Wiretap Act do affect if you are headquartered or you have sufficient assets in the United States, you're under jurisdiction no matter where the servers are. So your big rack of servers in Canada, your big rack of servers in Germany, or France, or the UK, you're incorporated in the United States, you're on, an order can get to, we can force you to divulge that information. The Europeans don't like this for obvious reasons. They're like, that is a domestic, you're using a domestic wiretap or domestic subpoena to effect that. Like, theoretically, you should say, go to the Irish court and say, I want that data, because there's a criminal investigation or there's tax evasion, there's something going on, and let the Irish, let their jurisdiction determine this. Because it's really hard to say how a New York court has jurisdiction over Ireland. And, well, we don't want to hear that. So it doesn't matter where the data is stored if the holder is a US company, and it conflicts with the GDPR. Because the GDPR says it's a data subject in the EU, a server in the EU, that's us. And you can get that. Like, you can get a wiretap order, you can get a subpoena, or the equivalent. You just have to go to that country's courts and say, hi, you may have heard of us, with the FBI. We have an investigation on this person. they'll work it out. It's multiple hoops, and they might say no, because they might say that doesn't meet our requirements for, our equivalent of probable cause. And it's a headache. But we can just do that, And also, a European court may not be as flexible. They might not just go like, yeah, we'll take your word for it. You're the FBI, you wouldn't lie. So, it's a bunch of language about multilateral agreements versus international agreements. It's how it plays out is less important than what it's going to do to Privacy Shield, because this is being used as a reason to suspend the Privacy Shield. That we, as in the United States, our laws don't have equivalent to the European data privacy standard. So where this is going to filter out is, especially as we have a tit-for-tat game for other things. Right? I started writing this when VW had their little problem. And we were going to find the living bejesus out of VW. And if you're unfamiliar, a sizable chunk of VW is owned by one of the German states. And so any injury to Volkswagen is an injury to Germany. Like all of a sudden, like, hey, there's privacy stuff going against Facebook. It's a tit-for-tat game. You want to do business here? Don't hurt Volkswagen. We can hurt Facebook and Google. We're not buying their cars, but we are using their services. This is another tit-for-tat game. It's similar to customs duties or whatnot, to make sure that trade goes on, but we have what we think is a roughly fair agreement. So that's how the stuff is playing out. It's going to change. I'm keeping an eye on it. I recommend you do too if it's interesting to you. Okay, and the last interesting law is, I forgot what the acronyms are, SESTA and FOSTA. It's sex trafficking. Used to be that Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act essentially said that any interactive provider of information services was immune for what the users did on that service. If I slander you on Reddit, Reddit is not responsible for my shitposting. And we thought that was a good idea, right? Everyone, it's a fundamental rule of the internet, you're allowed to troll people. You're allowed to do things, and you're allowed whatever you say, whatever you post, even if it's criminal, doesn't affect the provider. However, anyone ever hear of the company called Backpage? It was Village Voice's personals ads. It kind of did it was not a knockoff, but a similar approach to, say, Craigslist, right? Except all of a sudden they found out that it was really profitable to put escorts ads up, or to let people put escort ads up. And all of a sudden that was their business. Well, some people didn't like that, and they sue Backpage, and Backpage says, Communications Decency Act, we're an interactive computer service. What our users do on it ain't our problem. Go away. So SESTA and FOSTA removes that immunity for sites that foster sex trafficking. So the old rule, you're not liable for the content, even if the content is paid for by the provider, even if the content is edited by the provider, and even if the content describes a criminal activity. The new rule is that if you own, manage, operate, or attempting to make an ICS with the intent to promote or facilitate the prostitution of another, it is now a criminal act and can result in fines. How's that work? There's also the aggravated violation. If you promote it for more than 5 people, if you promote, in terms of the other conditions, if you believe force or fraud are involved. So, yeah, promotes or facilitates 5 or more persons in prostitution, reckless disregard that such conduct facilitated sex trafficking. And now, there's a difference between prostitution is theoretically consensual by both parties. Sex trafficking is where the provider of the sexual services is, shall we say, somehow induced via violence, fraud, threats, coercion. So knowingly assisting or supporting or facilitating sex trafficking are facilitating 5 or more persons in prostitution. So if you're Craigslist or Backpage and you have 5 ads for escorts, you are in violation. Subject to fines, subject to criminal action. You can go to prison for this. So, okay, that seems straightforward. However, how far does that extend? And Sesta Foster, it's not clear, right? If you're a company that only offers escort ads, you're fairly clearly like in that bucket. Right. Sex trafficking, knowingly assists, recruits, entices, harbors, transports, patronizes, or solicits a minor for commercial sex act. We don't like that, but it criminalizes sex worker ICS in the US. That may be a bad thing or a good thing, depending on your point of view. At Hope this year, there was a lively debate about this because there were some sex workers who came to talk about how they use the internet to make their, I guess, yes, they call them jobs, safer. They are in danger to provide their service. And it makes it harder if all of a sudden their ability to talk to one another, screen out clients, advertise, it pushes them sort of back into a pre-internet mode where they were in a lot more danger. Some people may view that as a good thing to eradicate prostitution. Other people may view that as a bad thing. I won't get into that debate right now, but intend to promote. Like companies like Backpage, Arrows.com are the 2 examples I have found. Are clearly in that bucket. That's what they do. They provide ad space for escorts. What about an advocacy site? A site dedicated not to ads, but for sex workers to talk amongst themselves about the business. Clearly it's facilitation of prostitution, even if it's not actually the business thereof. It's not advertising. And then does it create a duty for sites that are not in the business of prostitution but are instead merely sex positive? A friend of mine is also a lawyer in the technology field, and he pro bono represents I'm sorry to mention this, a furry site where some of you may laugh, some of you are like, that's something that I only discuss on Tuesdays. I won't judge you either way. Whatever you do is fine. Please don't make me see that. So, however, his problem was there were some people who were professional furries, and I was like, what is that? Like, no, don't answer that question. I don't want that image in my head. But they were like, well, some people, that's a side business. I'm like, all of a sudden, you just ran afoul of Sesta Foster. And they're like, one of their forums just shut down. Like, this is too much liability for us. We're going away. If. I was like, that you really signed it that way? Good, good, bad for you. But what about a purely agnostic service provider? We just provide communication, like Twitter, Reddit, Linode, people communicating with one another. And I'm thinking of the problem that like a truly agnostic communications provider, right? Like Twitter, you could probably figure out who the sex workers are on your platform by looking for specific code words, right? Someone who wants to talk about one thing are going to use different terms than people who are trying to get business as a sex worker. Reddit did a purge of any subreddit that even kind of came close to this. But what about someone who is a cloud hosting provider, right? How do you policing your environment's really, really hard, right? You have to basically do like full packet inspection to look for bad words. And that's all because the fear is like they're going to come and take our racks if we don't. So all of a sudden it's like this requires a great deal. This puts certain business models in jeopardy. Because all of a sudden now, like, you have to monitor your network for this? It's hard enough at like a large ISP to monitor for things like piracy. Like I've talked to some people, innocent images, that's we find child porn on the internet. And it's possible, it's actually like, technically it's a simple idea it's a simple problem to describe. We have MD5 hashes of known child sex images, we look for those, if we find one, we report it. Okay, that's technically, it's easy to describe. It's hard to do, but it's an engineering problem. How do you do that for bad words? Right? All of a sudden you've got a much more difficult problem, and you still have teeth. So it's a potential danger for people in sort of public-facing IT. If you're providing a communication service to the general public, that you think of the overhead it does, right? For a company like AWS, to like spool up a VM, like they want to make it as cheap as possible, like no customer service at all, because that all of a sudden makes it really unprofitable. We're spending more for the customer service than we are for the compute and the network. If we have to monitor it, that drives up the price. So reactions and trends to this. I think especially GDPR we're going to see geofencing of data. We're going to see essentially a stovepipe. We're going to say our European operations are over there, and you might go so far as to do like a business separation. We have a European subsidiary. Our connection with them is like they don't report to us, we don't report to them. They're a separate company. There's some money that changes hands at the end of every year. And maybe all they do is they really license our IP. Software development is done, how it's done, except ownership of code moves around. And it might be like you're less of a company and more like a bunch of holding companies. Or it might just be you have a flag for, are you an EU citizen or not? You just add that to your database. So that way you don't allow people to search for stuff. You don't allow people to, you can do anything you want to the American data set. The European data set, you have to have some kind of waiver to allow that kind of processing. But you're going to have to think about how did we get that PII? Or at least claiming to do so. Not my client, I'm thankful. Went through a lot of bother to stovepipe out every individual country where they got data. They held essentially healthcare data. It's people looking for healthcare providers and talking about their healthcare problems. And the fun part was, and they got down to like individual countries in case France changed the law. And then marketing wrote a script to go and suck up data from all the databases and put it on, and I'm not making this up, the unencrypted laptop of someone in marketing. Like, so and I knew the engineer like built this, and we had many conversations over beers with a whiteboard. Like, here's how you fit all the regs, and then let's talk engineering. And he's like, okay, we finally got it. I got approval, and I hired 3 DevOps people and a bunch of engineers, and we did this, and then he calls me up at 2 in the morning, like 6 months later. He's like, you wouldn't believe what marketing did. And they tell me that's from like, so someone with knowledge of SQL and like shadow, it's shadow IT made wrong. And so he's got to now fix that. So claiming to do geofencing, because you can always screw that up. There's going to be a lot of hand waving. Yeah, sure, we're compliant. Yep, we do that. Don't ask any questions. Yeah, yeah. We're going to make promises that we have no intention of keeping. I see withdrawing from markets. I imagine you're going to have EU companies also withdrawing from the American market. Like, that's too much of a headache. Because all of a sudden, you're afraid that your US subsidiary is doing stuff that you've trained your EU staff not to do. But someone in marketing in the US is like, oh yeah, we got this data set, let's do something with it. Like, so someone in France is getting a phone call to him like, what? What did marketing do? okay, I'm getting up. So you might just have like, we're going to withdraw from the US market. So like, it's just too much of a pain to sell to them. We're out. Every shop that had a large EU presence got the boatload of right to be forgotten requests. If you are in that space, figuring out how to automate them would be aces. Because I was helping one client through this, and we anticipated, like, oh, you'll probably get 3 to 4 a day. And day one, they got 9,000. Because they had, like, just like, if you want to be right forgotten, we had forgotten at company. I'm like, no one's going to bother with that. And like, we had to increase the size of our, we had to increase the size of the mailbox in exchange. It was bouncing back. I'm like, oh. Can I eat those words that says you probably don't need to automate it until Q3? Please, because I made that recommendation thinking that would be expensive because I couldn't write, like, that's going to be a lot of Python. I'm too expensive to write Python for you. It's like, I'm sorry. Somehow they, last time we sent them a statement of work, I just got back, we'll get back to you. Okay, conflicting boilerplate contracts. This is a big headache because you have your other contracts that you wrote, right, for all your other stuff, and some lawyer reviewed them. And now you have all these EU privacy ones that may, because you have like your American privacy, your American one that has something like, we are not liable for anything, right? That's in every contract. And then, well, we don't have, we can do whatever we want to your data, ha, 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 ha. And then you have that contract and you have the EU contract that says, here are your rights. And it's like, well, I signed both of them. What do they mean? Uh-oh. I don't know either. So that's another thing. You're going to have to go through and rewrite your American contracts because you might have European customers. And all of a sudden you have to make them, re-review all of those. And you may have had them already in space and now you have to push them out to your salespeople and make sure that they meet all those requirements again. So predicting the future. Are we going to see a US equivalent? There's the California Consumer Privacy Act that looks like a mini US GDPR. Some more rights. Private right of action. That's an interesting one. That allows you to sue if they don't do it. You don't have that right yet under the GDPR, but you do have that right in California. Non-discrimination for opt-out, as in, I can't charge more money to make you opt out. I can offer incentives, right? The non-privacy one, where we get to sell all your stuff, that's free. You charge, but that's going to be interesting. We're going to see tit-for-tat enforcement against US and EU companies. GDPR is a great tool to use for a regulator that wants to, not necessarily for privacy rights, but you put a tariff on our product and it's an important product for our country. We don't buy your cars, you drink our wine, all of a sudden we don't sell as much wine. How do we get at you? Well, Facebook. We're going to go after Facebook until you calm your jets. GDPR can use it selectively. Liability for data breaches. I'm thinking this is going to come out. We're going to see some kind of uniform data breach where there's actually fines, or not actually fines, but actual private right of action where you can sue or a class action for loss of data. And we'll standardize this across the 50 states rather than every state having kind of their own rules. Right now it's mostly for financial information, but think of a lot of stuff that isn't financial or healthcare that's still embarrassing. Photos of you doing something stupid that you thought were private aren't. That gets out. Just embarrassing stuff about you that you don't want on Pastebin. Individual states might do this, but under federal law, if the US Congress passes a law, it can essentially preempt the state law to say that this is now the requirement. That might actually be good if we have one set of standards across, because it's difficult enough to go, okay, we're doing business in the EU and we have to track the 30-odd EU countries, we have 50 states. You know, how does data breach work in Florida? It's different than the data breach in Nevada. They're getting more and more similar, but it would be nice to have one set of laws that make it a lot easier. Any questions? Sure.
I kind of deal with some of this stuff already, and I'm seeing multinational companies breaking into these, they're AKAs. So there's a parent company, and then there's a middle company, and then there's a slew of small companies that are there just as LLCs to just defend against lawsuits, and it's horrible.
Yeah, okay. I mean, the question is, are the observations that we're seeing where you're basically not one company, you're a bunch of closely moving companies. And that's a fairly standard thing to do for liability controls. My favorite one is in Philadelphia where I live. Taxi companies are often a mob of little LLCs. The LLC's assets are a 1998 Crown Vic with 400,000 miles. I'm like, that's your asset? Yeah. That LLC hit you. I'm like, that LLC has $82 in assets. I'm like, yep. You can sue them. Like, so, you know, my friend's got a broken leg, and you're like, yeah, you can take the Crown Vic. Great. Anything else?
How is, it's a little off topic, I guess, but how is ignorance in technical terms or guidelines managed in like court cases? So if you have a judge that just has no technical understanding or is technically ignorant, and this is somebody who's supposed to make a decision on something like CESTA, which could have, you know, well, I mean, not CESTA specifically, but, you know, some sort of legislation or
this is a problem we call dueling experts. And oftentimes you don't want the judge to have to know anything. You want an expert on your side that tells the story. I've helped do this. I've helped prepare expert testimony for what I think of as ignorant IT controls. It was like, you were so negligent in doing your duty that you deserve to get sued. Like, you know, all of our client data is on this server at a colo, and you came as a person working at the data center and you unracked everything in the rack, including our server, and wiped them, despite the sticker that said property of so-and-so dental office. Call this person before doing anything to them. Like, oh yeah, I cleaned all these systems. Like, those weren't yours. And we had, you know, we were working on the team that was like, the dental office going, I want to sue these people in oblivion, our entire client list. And it was stored correctly, but like, all of a sudden it's gone. Like, where are the backups? That's the next person we want to sue. Like, oops. So yeah, it's just like often, but we had to go and like explain to a judge what backups were and what sort of a industry standard level of competence is expected for someone who says, I are an IT professional, trust me. Sure.
So you talked a lot about statutory laws here that are passed by some kind of legislative body, you know, black letter law and stuff. Anything interesting going on in like the administrative law sphere since we had like a recent admin change?
Ooh, interesting. So the question is administrative law, which is sort of a neat little subset where you have a regulation that comes out of a law. You know, you grant power to a regulator, the law grants power to a regulated authority that they can then promulgate new rules, or really define those rules. I see that a lot in banking IT because that's a small change in a regulatory requirement is a lot of money, both to your business and also to your IT, you know, your IT department. Usually there's a sort of a sub-business in my space of people who do very, very specific industry consulting. They know that industry, they know it's heavily regulated. Healthcare and banking are the two that I think of. And there's watching little changes. You watch both industry, there'll be often regulatory guidance. the regulatory agency will put out a white paper that says, this is what we're concerned about. These are the audit guidelines, like Health and Human Services, Office of Civil Rights puts out audit guidelines for HIPAA and high-tech. And then you're reading like statements made at talks by high-level regulators. And I remember once sitting in a room, we had their talk on YouTube and we're going through like line by line and arguing about it. And this was like 9 o'clock at night because we're like, does that mean this rule has changed and this is required? And I was like, at one point this is bizarre. And another part, like, this is millions of dollars to one of our clients. So the difference between and are is all of a sudden critically important. It's always, it's not just necessarily the administration, it's the head of that department. Because oftentimes a new one will come in and say, this is what our department is concerned about, the other things are less important. And you try to figure out what they want. So it's watching audit guidelines are usually the ones I watch for. Because that's like actual stuff. Like this is what we have concerns about. Like when SEC came out, this is many years ago, and said, we're following as a standard the NIST cybersecurity, the CSF, while every other sort of financial service was regulated by FFIEC Auditor's Handbook, not Auditor's Handbook, but there's a set of like, here's the controls we're expecting. All of a sudden, whoa, we have a new set. Interesting. Why are they doing CSF? And then all of a sudden, well, I guess I have to read the CSF now. And so it's you can watch this by basically looking for audit guidelines. That's the level I would play at. Seeing like, also looking for any regulatory enforcement actions to see what do they actually care about, what do they go for. But at that point, you're getting into a lot of stuff. Law firm white papers are where I go, because that will sum up hundreds of pages of stuff into like one, into 5 bullet points. You go, do I actually have to worry about this, or can I stop caring? Cool. No other questions? You're in the back.
I have a question, just because we have our, like in the US, we have our own kind of dealings with the SEC and the ISPs. What's your perspective? Because I don't really know a lot about like your GDPR and your community. Like, what do they have in terms of ISPs dealing with privacy law? How do we do that?
So the question is like, how do we work with European ISPs?
Yeah.
They have to fit with, they have to follow the GDPR for their customers, how they're holding their data. You may see where like an ISP that's in both countries, both environments may bifurcate and go, here's how we store EU data, here's how we store US data. A lot of times they're still different subsidiaries anyway. And I'm out of time. Thanks.